and welcome to the panel on servicing in the national security space context. My name is Jared Rickwald. As Taylor mentioned, I'm a Director of Business Development for Space Logistics in Northrop Grumman. And this morning, I am very pleased to have distinguished co-panelists, Adam Harris and Rob Howdy. Adam Harris is a Vice President of Business Development at Orbit Fab. Previously, before that, Adam was Inspector General at the National Reconnaissance Office and a Vice President of Government Sales at SpaceX. Early in his career, Adam was a professional staffer on the House Appropriations Committee and Senate Intelligence Committee. That's where I met him. And he's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. My colleague Robert Howdy is the Strategy Director for Space Mobility and Logistics for Northrop Grumman. In this role, he leads strategy development for Space Logistics LLC, developing other on-orbit satellite servicing capabilities in the market. Prior to this, he served in the Central Intelligence Agency as a Senior Intelligence Service official working both the CIA and NRO. He also served as a program manager at DARPA and is a retired Air Force officer from the Office of Special Projects. So please join me in welcoming my co-panelists and thanking them for their time and participation. And if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in, and hopefully between Haley and myself, we can triage them and keep the conversation going. So I have some guided questions, but the panel goal is to examine the role of on-orbit servicing capabilities and space logistics in the cislunar space as part of the architectures of the national security, civil exploration, and commercial space communities. So we think about it in those three kinds of communities. And one of the questions that was posed to us by the Global Satellite Servicing Forum folks was, should the servicing capabilities differ across these communities? If so, why, when, where, and how? So to kick off the discussion, I'd like to pose the question, what do these communities, the national security space, civil space, and commercial space communities, need in terms of on-orbit servicing and space logistics capabilities to meet the objectives of their communities? So the broader question for Adam, please first, what do all these communities, what do we all need in terms of on-orbit servicing and space logistics?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Let me start by saying thanks to Jared, thanks to Robert for a great panel today. Looking forward to participating, and thanks to CONFERS for putting this on. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days of discussions and meetings. As Jared said, so I am currently at Orbit Fab, and we are looking to encourage the space economy. And really, we do that through supplying propellant to satellites and satellite servicing companies. But also, as Jared said, I have a career that spans through government programs with the National Reconnaissance Office, starting with the Air Force, and a little bit of space policy on the Hill. So happy to talk about kind of how both commercial and government interact in the satellite servicing. I think probably one of the amazing things about today, which is much different than 3-4 years ago, is that satellite servicing is being talked about across all three of those domains. And commercial really is looking at how do we generate additional revenue with the assets that we put on orbit. And a lot of that has to do with satellite servicing and all the different use cases of life extension to mobility, to really maneuvering satellites without really regretting that maneuver. What I mean by that is maneuvering the satellite in cases of things like debris collisions and other things. You can maneuver your satellite and not take 6 months of life off of your mission or your revenue generating for the commercial industry. I've been thinking a little bit about what's the difference on the government side. And we have the civil side on NASA, and we have DoD starting to think about these operations that we talk about cislunar space and lunar landers and things like that. And I think really the government's role, a lot of this is defining where they as a customer are going to take the space industry. We see NASA with the Artemis program and the lunar landers really reaching out beyond Earth orbit. And those are really great programs. I worked at SpaceX during COTS in the commercial crew program. I thought those were really great examples of government working with industry and really seeding the industry on putting programs in orbit. And those were really around providing services and logistics to the International Space Station, cargo to the International Space Station, people and transportation. I think we're going to see NASA do more of that as we move to the lunar surface eventually. I've also sort of noticed General Raymond and Space Force, as they've stood up Space Force, doing things around on-orbit servicing. Orbit Fab was really happy to participate in the Space Force's Catalyst Campus that just recently occurred as a accelerator for small businesses. A lot of the space companies were part of that and mentors. But the idea around that Catalyst Campus that occurred this past summer was on-orbit servicing and really getting entrepreneurial companies in that. And so that's really encouraging to see on the national security side. So I would say on an overall purpose, I think all three sectors, commercial, civil, and national security, are really seeing the benefits of on-orbit servicing, whether it is in low Earth orbit, a lot around ISS and those things, but really extending our reach to GEO, to extending our reach to cislunar, and extending our reach to lunar. Those types of missions are going to need logistics around them, and really encouraging to see that in the industry.
Thanks, Adam. That's great. And yeah, the Catalyst Campus program is a fantastic one, and we sponsored that from the space logistics side precisely because it was right in our wheelhouse. And you know, being able to meet so many people from these new space companies, these startups, with just fascinating ideas and technologies that they want to bring to bear across kind of all three communities and on all three problem sets. So Rob Howgie, over to you. From a national security community side of things, what do you see as some of the specific capabilities that the national security folks need, and the technologies that are going to be required for them to be successful in the domain?
Thanks, Jared. And Adam, it's good to be here with you as well. As OrbFab is frequently states, and rightfully so, Northrop Grumman is also supporting what they're doing. And from a company perspective, we want to make sure that we're bringing all of industry along with us. We obviously want access to be able to build capabilities to service satellites, but as much as possible, we want those standardized interfaces as well. That's why we're all here as part of this panel. So I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the idea of a pre-positioning infrastructure. This past summer, I took a cruise up to Alaska, and talking with some dog sled teams, it was interesting to find out that over that 1,000-mile race with 12 or so dogs, got to start with 16, the winners aren't the dogs that are necessarily healthiest or the strongest or the best drivers, mushers. What they shared with me is the way you win the race is who's got the best logistics. So what the teams will do is they're allowed to pre-position supplies along their route. And those that have more money can pre-position better quality food, more of it, and other supplies along the way. And that's one of the key discriminators for those that are the largest teams. And it kind of builds on itself. Each year you win, you've got more opportunity for sponsorship and money. I think in terms of other analogies as well, while I love building spacecraft, I also love cars. And when I watch what's happening in the EV market now, the Lucid Air Dream might be a dream from the price standpoint for someone like me, but 520 miles of range. And yet BMW is coming out saying, we think the number is 373 miles, which is kind of an interesting limit that they're putting on it, arguing that at that point, you'll be somewhere else where you can recharge. And that's kind of what we're struggling when we think about the cislunar space. You're talking 9 times GEO just to get out to the moon, potentially 35 times GEO. These are extraordinary distances. What are we going to need along the way? And from my perspective, again, as someone who worked for the government, but speaking from my personal perspective, based on my experience, I think it's going to require some U.S. government investment. Now, fortunately, NASA's moving out in that direction, but the U.S. government, the national security side, the U.S. Space Force is going to need some of these capabilities. And the example that comes to mind is I used to be stationed with the Navy overseas. And at the base that I was at, it was interesting. We always maintained a very, very large stockpile of fuel. And the premise there was not just that when the ship arrived, it's got supplies that it needed enough supplies so it can very quickly turn around and keep moving. And in other words, it didn't have the opportunity to wait. So while I see the US government may be the impetus to putting some of these outposts, some of these refueling stations, they're likely going to buy an amount of fuel or tanks or however we're going to do that. But the trade is going to be, if commercial comes there, those who are providing those depots, those refueling stops, they're going to have to hold enough fuel because the US government may need that when they get there. They may never use it, but the bottom line is they're going to have to hold that. So they're going to need to factor that in as well. I think there's another aspect as well that the US government is likely to drive to more depots than, say, the commercial industry. Commercial industry may not be in quite the race that, for example, US Space Force might be. They may have to get from point A to point B faster than an adversary, or to deal with a situation, another outpost or something else that's going on in space. Again, to use some car analogy, you think about like the Bugatti Veyron. You're traveling 253 miles an hour. In 12 minutes, you're out of gas. So if that's the USSF and they're not doing the most fuel efficient transfer from one point to the next, they're going to need more depots in order to refuel, which brings another twist on that, which is the Navy, when they've got ships out at sea, sometimes they don't even have time to come into port. So this opens up the whole idea of underway replenishment, which we really haven't thought a whole lot about how you do that in space, because unlike shipping lanes in space, that can be horribly inefficient. But I think there might be an opportunity there where the US Space Force can't afford to do this 3-body cislunar loop-to-loop to get from point A to B. And they may be willing to pay to have someone who can come alongside at certain points and meet with them so they don't have to come to a complete stop or veer out of the way to go to a depot. And the last part of that for me is, if we care about the depots, then we care about protecting those depots. We care about protecting commerce going through those depots, which means now we're starting to think about, what if an adversary initiates a blockade? What if there's piracy? So there's lots of wrinkles with that. Another aspect that comes to mind is space domain awareness. It's one of those, no one wants to pay for it. Everyone would like to have that capability. I think about in the terms of FAA with the air traffic control system today. It's really a combination of two things. One is the aircraft squawking via its transponder, its location, but also a series of radars skin painting to basically verify where that aircraft is. The challenge when we're talking about XGO is these ranges, radar is just not going to be feasible. So it's likely going to be passive, but the government's going to need lots and lots of those sensors to keep tabs on what's going on. One twist on that would be, what if we had systems like transponders on aircraft or AIS beacons like we've got on ships to essentially squawk their location and make it easier for everyone, not just from a national security standpoint, but to be able to handle that space traffic, which brings me to the next piece on communications. Commercial might be able to get by with kind of the old dial-up speeds, but for my expectation is for national security missions, we're likely going to require higher bandwidth. We might be doing things like telerobotics, which over those ranges would be really, really hard, which gets to another point I'll make in a second. But also, we might need the ability to go all the way back to Earth and hit, say, a geo relay, or maybe even go through the atmosphere. So you're talking about much higher power levels in order to be able to do that. That might be a more unique need for the US government. I thought Carl yesterday from AFRL really raised an important point, that when we're dealing with cislunar and we're outside the Earth's atmosphere, from an FCC perspective, we're not trying to get through the Earth's atmosphere. So it opens up other frequency ranges we could use that that we could use for cislunar that you wouldn't necessarily use going from space to ground or ground to space through our atmosphere. It frees up some of those limitations. So the other aspect there is how we tie in autonomy. So over those ranges there, we're going to need a lot more autonomy on the spacecraft. But I see a lot of overlap with civil on that as well. A lot of work to be done there, but I think the first step is going to be get the telerobotics in place so you can do it, period. I think Gordon Ressler's comments earlier today talked about that, like with robotic arms, what we're doing with the MRV, that affords us the ability to do things that are autonomous, but also to be able to do things that we haven't done before. In other words, the telerobotic, to be able to handle things we hadn't planned on. So in summary, for me, I kind of see civil as paving the way with the NASA missions to the moon and beyond. I see DoD as vying to be able to have these stopping points along the way. In other words, just simply a refueling depot, a gas station, and we're all going to benefit. But it also opens up a responsibility, accountability on the Department of Defense to provide protection for those depots, as well as to kind of enforce the rules of the road. So we've got good behavior in space.
Okay, thanks, Rob. That's a great summary there. I'll, taking away a couple of your high points there, fuel depot, the ability to refuel spacecraft, have them prepared to receive it, the ability to protect those fuel depots and assets, robotics and telerobotics and autonomy and potentially, underway replenishment. I guess, pushing it back towards Adam now, with Orbit Fab wanting to be gas stations in space and actually service, I would argue, all three of the communities, right? The civil, the national security, and the commercial. What do you see as the path forward, Adam, in driving interoperability across those enabling capabilities for those three space communities?
Yeah, and I think we've talked a lot about through this conference about establishing standards for those interfaces, and really there are lots of ways and methods of doing that, but I think national security and civil space can really lead by giving what they need. So they sort of set mission priorities towards what they need for on-orbit servicing logistics. So great to have them sort of starting this conversation about satellite servicing. I would say, what do we need to see here in the future? I think one of the big changes that's happened in this industry is really the cost of launch. We've seen the cost to get to low Earth orbit really change, and that's, to me, really what's made the in-space economy, the number of commercial companies coming into this industry really blossom. I sort of come at that from, I think a lot of that started with the NASA COTS program. So this isn't a commercial versus government sort of things. I think all ships rise sort of as NASA puts those kind of programs together and DoD starts thinking about where they want to go in space. So I think all of those sectors actually interplay and work together here. But we really have seen LEO become a place where a lot of entrepreneurial programs can happen. There's a saying sort of thing, it's a question mark of, are you really a space company if you don't have anything in space? And so one of the ideas at Orbit Fab when we started, so the company started in 2018, we really focused on getting things to orbit. We had our Tenzing tanker launch in June of this year, putting it on orbit. Prior to that, we had put a couple experiments on the International Space Station. And so all of these things work together of working with NASA and putting these things in orbit. But I guess my point is, a lot of this starts in low Earth orbit because the launch economics have changed. Space is a very capital intensive industry, and startup companies have to decide, are you going to spend, if you're a startup company and you say, I need to spend $250 million to get to orbit, you're probably not going to get funded. You're probably not going to get off the ground, figuratively and literally. But if you can get to orbit if you look at SpaceX's website on rideshare, so I just use public information here, 180 kilograms can get to orbit for $1 million. So we're talking about $8,000 a kilogram essentially for ride shares to orbit. And that economics have really changed what can be done. You can take technology. So a lot of this talking about standardizing technologies. One of our ideas at OrbitFab was to get our refueling interface on our tanker, get it in orbit. It really raises the TRL level, but the learning that goes on at a company starts with the system engineering, the engineering of components, the putting them on spacecraft, getting them on a launch vehicle, getting them to orbit. That learning is super valuable for the entrepreneurial community. So to go beyond the sort of dreams of companies and getting on orbit really is a important step for the commercial industry. I would say then NASA and the national security community can look at those ideas and see what standards will come as those things are proven as on-orbit capabilities. And so I think a lot of this will be who can get to orbit, how does that happen? But that's a lot more efficient these days. The hope is that launches to GEO, GTO, and GEO, and launches to cislunar and the lunar surface become a lot more frequent because the economics of those launches are kind of the same as they have been over the last 20 years. What we think we need is we need sort of this bustling economy, this companies working with other companies, companies providing components to other companies. And I think a lot of that will happen starting on the commercial side because the commercial side can go really fast. My hope is that national security and civil space see that. And I really liked what Rob said about, I think it's true as we get further and further away. So as we talk about L1 or lunar surface destinations, we will need a logistics trail there. For OrbitFab's purposes, it's definitely, we talk about fuel and propellant and getting those commodities to those spacecraft that need it. But logistics is even bigger than that. I mean, think power, think data, transmission and communication and transportation. All of those things are things that government initiatives could really push that the commercial industry will wait a little bit. For instance, I know there's some commercial programs thinking about the lunar surface, but arriving on the lunar surface is one thing, staying there and having the logistics for power, for data, for transportation, to be able to do both national security and civil missions, but also generate revenue from a commercial standpoint is going to take a lot of logistics, I think, on the lunar surface. And there's a lot of opportunity there as we move forward.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I mean, certainly, your guys is at OrbitFab, your tagline is gas stations in space.
Sure.
We're going to need Walmarts and Costco's. I'm not picking any one big box store, right? But that's the logistics train you're going to need to sustain persistent human operations on the moon and ultimately Mars.
Or at least a mini mart, like a little 7-Eleven.
Yeah, 7-Eleven, Citgo's, whatever it is, right?
Taquito is on sale today.
Well, I think a good example is, so I'll go back to the COTS program. So NASA identified launch and transportation to ISS as a major need they had as the shuttle was going away. They identified that a need, but now we have companies like Axiom or Sierra Space or others that are thinking about lunar or in-orbit space stations that will commercially take over what ISS is doing today. Those kind of initiatives are what grows out of both NASA and national security saying, this is a destination we want to support. I think we'll see that in the cislunar environment in the future, but I think it will take some leadership on the government side to continue pushing towards those things.
That's a great, thoughtful point, and it's actually a perfect segue. So Dale Arney asked a question in the chat here. Are there good terrestrial examples of commercial services changing how national security operates? What's the lag time, and how much of that commercial capability has to be duplicated by the government for security purposes, et cetera? So Rob, I mean, you want to take that question? I mean, these are ubiquitous capabilities we're all going to need. Are there lessons to be learned either on the ground or other elements of space that show an instructive means for the national security area to be able to leverage without having to completely replicate things that are either done in the civil or the commercial space?
So having spent most of my career working for the NRO, again, not speaking for the National Reconnaissance Office, but from my personal experience, two things come to mind. Obviously, the NRO has imaging capability. There is a huge push within the NRO because commercial is finally where we need them, where the NRO needs them to be to make that a viable market. And so the NRO is absolutely looking at that, and as well as NGA to be able to just procure that capability. In other words, we buy that imagery commercially today. There's still going to be more exquisite needs that will always be there, but the idea is to offload that to commercial as much as possible. The other aspect, which I know from personal experience, is on the comm side. Obviously, an organization like the NRO moves tons and tons of data, terabytes and terabytes of data, and they're working in the same vein to be able to use commercial capability to buy SATCOM capability as well to be able to do that. Obviously, if you can encrypt it, that addresses many of those needs. The challenge comes down to, again, there's niche missions. If you look at it from the DoD side, that's all great until that capability is denied, either from the ground or a satellite malfunctions. And so you need to make sure you've got guaranteed green lights to be able to push data. And so there's still going to be a need for US government only capabilities, at least in a conflict, or to fill some of those niche gaps. Those are two things that just immediately come to mind.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say the other area that comes to mind in the space industry is really space launch around national security space launch, and what was previously the ELV program office, now NSSL. What Air Force, Space Force now did in launch is well, let me start back, history lesson, sorry about that, is 2011, SpaceX had launched 2 Falcon 9s at that point. We had launched Falcon 1s, but it put 2 Falcon 9s in orbit. And we went to the Air Force and said, the way the Air Force procures launch at that time was very cost plus. It was government only, and a lot of requirements were driving cost into the ELV program. And there was a real desire to lower costs and to take advantage of what commercial was doing. And what we found was really the way that what changed government's mind was when commercial came to the government and said, well, this is now an area where we're certain enough about the technology that we could do this on a fixed price basis. And the government did completely change how they purchase launch. So the recent round of national security space launch are firm fixed price for the launch service. Those services in the past had not been purchased in a firm fixed price way, but that gives the government some budget certainty over where these programs are growing. So that fixed price way of doing business in the launch industry, I think, is similar in the commercial communications. It's also happening in imagery. So NGA and others are buying commercial imagery, sort of buy the image versus buying the entire infrastructure and a satellite, and taking advantage, quite frankly, of commercial risk posture. So the commercial risk, what I mean by that is commercial companies put their capital into launching and putting satellites in orbit, and then the government can then buy those services by the drink. And that is a paradigm shift, I would say, on the government side for space programs, because up until 2010 or so, the government would only buy bespoke programs that were really all around government requirements and government capabilities only. Now we're seeing them think more about this as an industry and buying services, which allows commercial industry to kind of flourish around the edges of those programs.
So that's a good point, and it is, we're certainly seeing more of it. You mentioned the commercial LEO destinations as NASA's follow-on to ISS, where essentially they're asking industry to build a hotel around them as an anchor tenant to their requirements. Kind of puts the onus on industry to share we're actually to absorb the business risk of getting that hotel there, understanding that I'm always going to have at least this one room rented. What do you think, and I'll ask it both of you, what do you think the impediments are there of industry answering that call as the government tries to move more to renting or buying by the drink as a service business models, as opposed to the bespoke, I pay you for an end item that will be mine to operate, for its entire life. Where are we in industry, or what do you see are the impediments to industry meeting that call when it comes to especially the cislunar space and what NASA and the Space Force need?
Rob, do you mind if I jump in there first?
Please.
So I would say that the first thing that comes to mind is, number one, we ought to all remember this isn't a zero-sum answer, because I think we will have both, because national security has certain missions that they need to accomplish that will only be accomplished with them as a customer. NASA's the same way. So NASA with exploration missions to destinations, other planets, destinations beyond Earth orbit, are programs that NASA will continue to initiate and do. So I think as government programs think about what they are doing in Earth orbit, but also on the way in cislunar and lunar destinations, I think the more they can think about how those capabilities can enable this bustling economy that we talk about. And when I say bustling economy, I should probably define what I mean by that is the space industry really has two exports currently. It's either communication or remote sensing that are being, and those are exports, I would say, from space back to Earth. We're seeing a lot of ideas about in-space manufacturing and other things, but the hope actually for on-orbit servicing is that the in-space economy becomes companies interacting with each other in space and really trading goods and services, trading for orbit fabs, really around propellant and other things to extend life of satellites and others. I think I would go back to, because it's not a zero sum, I think there are still definitely government areas that need to be pushed on. What a good example of that is, one, the government really can indicate where they're heading and be a commercial, be a guidepost for where they want the industry to go. And I think acting as a customer is the government's number one idea here for helping commercial industry. Number two, I think they can seed some ideas. So when we talk about standardization, obviously at OrbitFab, we talk a lot about standardizing refueling interfaces and docking interfaces and those things, but there's some more fundamental standardization. There's things like, shall we use English or metric systems for measurements? A debate that never ends in our country. Or should we standardize around fuel types? Chemical propulsion obviously uses hydrazine as a majority use today. Electric uses xenon. There are some other propellant types that are being thought about, but one of the important things that NASA can do in the future is think about how ISRU, how we can use resources from the moon and asteroids to create propellant in the future. They are thinking about some of those technologies, and they're thinking about how to turn water into hydrogen and oxygen and use those as fuel types. I think there's a lot of research that the government really can push here that will take us from the propellants that need to be lifted off the Earth and sent to the Earth to things that we can do in space and have an economy around that. And those are going to be research and development things that I think the government will end up pushing at the beginning.
Yeah, I guess I would, what I'm going to add is not very space specific, but to me, I think there's two areas that are really important. I used to be a program manager at DARPA, actually, with Gordon Ressler. And we used to joke about there's thinking outside the box. Isn't that what DARPA should do? And kind of the response was, but you have to at least acknowledge there is a box there in the first place. And so the first thing I would come to is the box isn't actually technical. I think the box right now is budget. So the USSF has stood up now, the Space Force. They've got, pun intended, an astronomical challenge. They've got to now execute all these ongoing programs, comms, missile warning, precision, position navigation timing, GPS, and so forth. But they also have to pursue their space capabilities that they need as well. So something like cislunar is out on the edge. It's great to see what AFRL is doing, trying to pull that in, but the last letter is L, it's a lab. So how do we get that into the main programs? And the answer is, I don't believe you do. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So at AFA, just a couple of weeks ago, we had discussions as Northrop Grumman with a number of thought leaders in the Air Force and Space Force in particular. And one of the feedbacks was they just want to buy this capability commercially. And while that's a knee-jerk response and it sounds great, I can't blame them. But the challenge with that, though, is we need a set of requirements to be able to build to. And so at the most basic level, it comes down to the first one is standards. If you're not going to define the standards, at least when we develop them, endorse them so we know that we're building to things that you care about. Especially when I think about what we did on the MEV. That started about 10 years ago to be able to get to that capability. The US government didn't pursue that. We did because we saw there was a commercial market. Now that commercial market is maturing, we're talking with the government. We're not going to be able to do that, I don't think, as easily with things like cislunar. That it's not going to be a chicken and egg. I think that's going to require them to work more closely with us. I thought Pam Melroy's comments about this soundbite of collaborate to compete makes a whole lot of sense. It's why we're working with OrbFab and others. We want the market open to all, which means we need the standards. The second piece, and this is not doesn't have a whole lot of curb appeal for satellite engineers, but it's the policy side. How are we going to define the amount of work that we went through just to have an imager at GEO that's not designed to look at the Earth, but it's looking at other satellites as long as we have their permission? How can we do that? All the FCC authorizations, ITU, and so forth. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenge when we start opening that up to cislunar. What's the policy? Well, this is the US government policy. We're going to need to thinking about standards across the world that we're all going to agree to these norms of behavior. So to me, the two areas would be working on the standards and on the policy. Standards, if you're not going to give us requirements, at least endorse them on the policy side. I think that's really where we're going to need to see their leadership.
Great point, Rob. I mean, if you know, refueling, on-orbit servicing, if there is going to be a robust servicing economy that can be commercial, there has to be a robust economy there for activities in space that need servicing and sustainment in order for there to be sufficient infrastructure and critical mass for it to be provided as a service offering. That's something they can buy by the so great thoughts there. You started to talk about policy implications there, and you named a couple of the big sticky ones. You know, Adam, as a former policy guy, what are the other areas of policy where our technology might actually be ready with what we've demonstrated with Mission Extension Vehicle 1 and 2, what you've got with your tensing, you know, your RAFTI valve in orbit right now being tested? You know, where are those policy hurdles that we need to identify cooperatively as a community and tee them up to really be a force multiplier for the commercial, for the civil, and for the national security aspects to work in harmony here?
Yeah, well, I would start with saying, you know, the Northrop Grumman Space Logistics MEV program probably knows this a lot better than anybody because they went through this and did it. But, you know, the policy around launching something to orbit has regulatory implications, and you have to go through a regulatory process to get that approved. If you have a imagery system like MEV did on imaging and other spacecraft, you have to get that approved through NOAA, for instance. Communications, the FCC has a role in how your spacecraft is communicating. And so I would say the best thing that we could have, I think, on the regulatory side is a conversation about how to do on-orbit servicing and to lessen the regulatory burden. You know, when you, at your house, if you're building an addition, you have a permit, you know, and that's all around safety and those sorts of things, but you have one permit office you go to. If you're going to space, you know, again, MEV was probably, you guys know this a lot better than I. There's 3 or 4 different agencies you go to, and the risk to the commercial industry or to a company around having 3 different agencies that can say no is that you could get right up to launch and one of them could say no. And you never quite know the answer. And so I think from a policy standpoint, regulation around on-orbit, because on-orbit servicing is always going to involve 2 spacecraft coming together in some way. That could be docking, that could be inspecting, that could be maneuvering. There's lots of these ideas that we're talking about through CONFERS that haven't been done in the past. And right now our regulatory process is multiple different agencies and multiple different folks that can say no. And so I think there's really an opportunity to streamline that both at single approval points to the US government, because the US government has, through the Outer Space Treaty, has a responsibility for things that are launched from the United States to make sure that spacefaring activities are responsible on the international scene. And so, but I think a lot of these things are the way the United States is going to lead. And so I think on the regulatory side, we could see some real leadership through the government on how we can do these approvals for on-orbit servicing, how we can really streamline all the activities that are going to be necessary for 2 objects in space coming together in the future. But yeah, I would put that back to you, Jared, on the MEV experience. I think it was a trailblazer, and I think on the regulatory side, you probably have more than I do on what happened there with that experience.
Sure, and you know, kind of stepping out of moderator role here, you know, seeing that more on MEV2 than MEV1, but you know, you're right. There are a number of regulatory authorities that we have to go to, and you know, make the case of safety, right? First and foremost, safety of flight. Make the case that the technology is ready. Make the case that our concept of operations doesn't introduce undue risk either to ourselves or to the client in this case. You know, and that's just the government side. Then you get insurance involved. You know, internationally, what you know, my boss Joe Anderson has said is internationally it's even more complex. Whereas, you know, here with our regulators in the United States, if there is no rule, then we just prove that we're not breaking a rule and that we're not being inherently unsafe. Whereas in other countries, if you don't have a rule, you can't do it until someone writes the rule. So it's kind of the positive compliance of you have to have a rule with which to comply first. You know, not necessarily there is no rule for this because the rules were written 30 years ago when no one dreamt that the space economy would be where it was because the barriers to entry of launch were so cost prohibitive. Now, you know, thank you SpaceX, good job, Adam, and others. You know, that barrier is gone. And so then what are the next barriers? And the policy one, you know, I think as commerce begins to stand up its new office to do space control, right, and have the commercial, you know, think Coast Guard versus Navy kind of thing, right, where they're stepping into that role of regulating space more centrally. You know, hopefully some of these things can be streamlined, and that will help create the norms that makes it easier for the rules to be created in other countries where they need a rule to do it in the first place.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, I just see something came in here on this. I'll get to that later. In terms of interoperability, you know, how much have you seen in terms, I mean, we have some grand visions out there, and certainly AFRL with their ADOX program, the Advanced Depot Operations for Ex-Lunar Space, certainly where NASA is trying to go, Artemis, Moon, lunar habitat, persistent human operations on the lunar surface, beyond fuel and fuel types and fuel interfaces, what other types of interoperability or complementary with an E operations and missions do we think that the civil and the military or national security side need to be thinking about?
Well, actually, I want to come back to something you said, because Adam, you kind of teed it up. The idea of fuel. The most logical conclusion is if you're trying to do cislunar types of missions, xenon's going to be the way to go. And if you're out in the middle of Arizona and diesel is the only thing available, and you're a conventional gasoline engine, that doesn't help you. So I thought Carl, again, pointing to him from AFRL yesterday, made a good point of, we're talking about standards for interfaces and so forth, but something as basic as, do we push for a single fuel in space? And I'm going to argue both sides of it. On the one side, it would make the logistics far easier. There's lots of exotic options going after nuclear. There's thoughts about hiring a Starship tanker to be up there, harvesting water from the moon to make fuel. But that's not what we have that's available now. And so to me, xenon is compelling for a lot of reasons. But the catch, though, is for the US government, again, back to the Bugatti Veyron car, they're likely going to need high delta V. The civil, unlikely, commercial, unlikely, but for the US government, national security. And so how does all that play together? And so again, back to getting the US government to at least come alongside us and endorse, understand, if we as a community say xenon's the answer, then that's the only thing you're going to have, which to me drives things in a slightly different direction. Maybe that's all that's available, but it would mean rather than having, we love the HCTs, the Hall current thrusters. Right now, the Hall current thrusters are driven. You can adjust the voltage, get a little more oomph out of them. I joke we might want that new Corvette Z06 that's coming out that's supposed to be able to operate at 9,000 RPM. The normal engine is going to come apart. To be able to think about thruster technology, particularly EP, that can be driven much harder for much longer, or potentially an array of HCTs. That's something that I think everyone would benefit from. There's overlap between the civil and the commercial and the national security. But to me, it all comes down to the most basic. Do we think xenon's the answer?
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here. I think one of the important points to think about for our future, both across all civil, commercial domains, is for each mission is going to have its set of requirements. And so some are going to be high delta V, some are going to be high efficiency. And so we're going to see the need to have both chemical and electric propulsion and combinations of those. The other thing I think that's important for the industry to realize is we built spacecraft platforms or spacecraft buses to last to mission life. And so some of those long mission lives are up to 15 years in GEO, but we're seeing also in LEO spacecraft that are looking at mission lives of 1 year or 3 years or 5 years. When we talk about on-orbit servicing, really we're talking about components that live for a long term. And I think thinking in a very long term, when we talk about a permanent lunar base or something that's permanently around the moon, what we're talking about is a spacecraft capability that can live in those orbits and live through the space environment, but then be serviced and then be upgraded and then be refueled and added to. So yeah, that's a great thing that AFRL and NASA could really push on, is taking the technologies we have. Thruster technologies is a good one, And let's think about if we were pushing 25 years worth of propellant through a thruster, how would that be different?
Not to mention, Adam, the driving electronics behind them too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we are starting to know the space environment well enough that we can design these systems to do that. I think, it really, I like the car analogy. It's the, the dragster that's going to last for 10 seconds or an hour before it needs everything to be changed on it. Is a little bit how we've built spacecraft in the past. What we need is the Honda Civic that's just going to keep on trucking, or the old Ford pickup that's going to be used in the farmlands. Those are capabilities that really are enabled by having, I think, lower cost launch and lower cost barriers to getting to space. I think we're going to see a lot more of those long life capabilities that just keep on trucking.
Hey, Adam, if I could just add, I think I agree with you on your approach. You think about like the F-150, it's not just something that's reliable, but the flip side of it is, as they're proliferated, as there's more and more of them, it means that there are parts that are more ubiquitous available. In other words, having a depot where if pretty much everybody is using F-150 compatible components, and then taking that all the way out to its logical extension, maybe I've got an F-150, and we talk about the junkyard, but the ability then to harvest some of those components. So to me, all this comes back to the standards.
Absolutely.
Okay, good stuff. Well, I mean, we're almost at time, so I'll throw out one more question, and if we get another question or two in the chat, then I think we'll be about perfectly timed here. But all three of us on this panel are former government officials in some capacity, dealing in national security and space and military. But where we sit now in industry and kind of digesting what we've been discussing here about the capabilities, the promise, the need for persistent and serviceable operations in this cislunar space. What are the one or two recommendations that you would give to a former Senator, now Director Nelson, or to a Secretary of the Air Force, Chief of Space Operations, to focus and prioritize, how they can be most successful? What are the two recommendations you'd make? Rob, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'll come back to when you're a program manager at DARPA, you've got this great idea on how it's going to support the military. You get that program going for a while, but in the end, you have to get investment from the military. You're never going to be able to complete your program. That's basically, you're driven for that transition. So you got to have the coolest tech, quote the DARPA hard, but to transit, you're forcing that transition to take place. And right now, to me, I look at the largest players being the Space Force, the NRO, and NASA. To me, it gets back down to the basics, and it's the whole reason we're having this conference. Is ideally, I would want them to help set the standards, and I've said that before. That's different than just participating in these panels. We need to know, what is it you think your needs are, and if you can't do that at the most basic, continuing to endorse the standards as we develop them. Meaning, as you're producing a new satellite build, to force in those requirements, to pay that delta cost on a multi-billion-dollar program, to start creating some prepared interfaces so that we can take advantage of that 9, 10, 15 years after that satellite's on orbit.
Yeah,
Great.
so
Adam?
yeah, so Jared, I would say I only have one, and the way I would describe it is, I think government program managers need to allow themselves to think big. The easiest thing for a government program is to ask, how did we do this in the 1980s or the 1990s, and just keep doing that. I believe we're at a point right now where, on an international level, doing the same thing is going to have us fall behind. And I think government program managers need to allow themselves to be innovative. They need to allow themselves to use the technology that's coming to bear right now. There is a lot of technology in the space industry that's both being backed by the government and backed by venture capital. And I would say, to me, that's the one lesson I would give to my ex-government colleagues is allow yourself to think innovative, allow yourself to be bold in what your programs are doing, because it is super easy to just keep doing what we've always done. But I think the lesson we're learning right now is that when you keep doing the same thing over and over, we're going to fall behind. There are others in the international community that are going to move past us. And we need to be innovative. We need to push the space industry, because I do think it's the ultimate high ground. We need to have government programs that continue to push the envelope.
So Adam, if I could just follow up on that, it's interesting because the feedback that I've gotten is what we're talking about is a threat to those mainline programs, because those mainline programs are producing a production line. And so what we're now talking about is, well, that would mean I could slow that production line way down. Now, there are some simple realities, which is called, this, as we all know, the standing army. If you build a satellite every 3 years, and I say I'm going to build a satellite every 9 years, it's going to be very difficult to hold on to that talent. But to your point, that's where the rest of the world's going anyways. It's going to happen. And so to me, the idea would be lead the turn. So what are some of the things that it opens up? Now you've got the ability to not just do life extension, but I could come up and I could bring an adjunct payload. I could connect that in with a power and data port and so forth. So you're not just extending the life of that mission, rather than having to wait for 3 spacecraft down the road to be able to get a technology to a TRL level where you can fly it. You could fly it on the next one, and you don't have to do it with the launch and deal all the couple loads analysis and so forth. Put the thing on space, have that prepared interface, and you connect it in and try it. And then you're at TRL level 9 and integrate that in. So to your point is thinking the bigger picture. It's not just about life extension. It's about completely rethinking the way we do our satellites today.
I think that's a great point. Another thing the government can do is really encourage education and university research and STEM education. And the point I would follow on with what you made there, Rob, was, kids coming out of school today want to work on space programs that launch in 18 months or 2 years. They don't want to be on a 10-year, 12-year program. They want to be, work on a widget and then maybe have that launch someday. I think we can have both. I think the government can have both the very large programs. ISS is the greatest example, I think, a very large capability. I think Artemis and lunar landing is right on point there. But there are also lots of opportunities to take the new ideas from folks that are really excited about the space industry, really some of the university folks that are putting together CubeSats and other things and turning those into programs that assist national security and assist NASA. So I think there's a lot of room for growth there, and I don't think it's a zero-sum game. Jared, I see the screens kicking us off.
Yes, that is the music playing at the Academy Awards as someone gives me the hook for rambling too long. So no, thank you guys. This has been a fantastic conversation. Really thoughtful commentary, really great experiences and observations shared. So with that, thank you to CONFERS and the Global Satellite Servicing Forum. Thank you, Haley, as our producer here. And hopefully everyone enjoys the rest of the conference. Thank you, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks,
Adam. Thanks, Jared.